The doors of the cold prisoner compound swung open on Christmas Eve 1944, and Sergeant Karl Hoffmann couldn't believe what he was seeing. American soldiers were gesturing for the starving German prisoners to follow them, not to an interrogation room or a work detail, but toward a mess tent filled with the aroma of roasted turkey and fresh bread. The men around him stood frozen, convinced this was some kind of psychological torture, a cruel joke before execution. But then Private Anthony Russo smiled, handed Karl a plate piled high with more food than he'd seen in months, and said in broken German, "Merry Christmas, friend." In that moment, everything Karl thought he knew about this war, about his enemies, about humanity itself, was about to change forever. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The bitter wind cut through the French countryside like a blade on December 24, 1944. Carrying with it the scent of snow and the distant rumble of artillery that had become as constant as breathing for the men who fought in this endless war. Near the city of Reims, in a hastily constructed prisoner-of-war compound surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, 143 German soldiers huddled together for warmth in wooden barracks that did little to keep out the freezing temperatures. Sergeant Karl Hoffmann sat on a rough wooden bench, his Wehrmacht uniform torn and stained with mud from the battle where he'd been captured 3 days earlier. His hands wrapped around his knees as he tried to conserve what little body heat he had left. At 32 years old, Karl had seen more death and destruction than any man should witness in a lifetime, having survived the brutal Eastern Front where temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and men froze to death standing upright in their foxholes. The young corporal next to him, a boy named Wilhelm Fischer, who couldn't have been more than 19, shivered violently despite wearing every layer of clothing he possessed. Wilhelm had been conscripted only 6 months earlier, pulled from his family's bakery in Munich where he had been learning his father's trade, measuring flour and kneading dough instead of loading rifles and dodging bullets. His hands, which should have been dusted with flour, were instead covered in frostbite and the grime of war. Karl looked at the boy and felt a deep sadness settle over him like a heavy blanket, knowing that Wilhelm's youth had been stolen by a conflict he barely understood, fighting for ideals that had been hammered into his head by years of propaganda and mandatory Hitler youth meetings. Across the barrack, Lieutenant Hans Becker stood near the small iron stove that provided inadequate heat for the 50 men crammed into this space, his officer's insignia still visible on his collar despite the dirt and wear. Hans had been a schoolteacher before the war, instructing children in mathematics and history in a small town near Dresden, a place that seemed to exist in another lifetime, another world entirely. He had joined the Wehrmacht believing the stories about defending the fatherland, about the necessity of their cause. But 4 years of combat had stripped away those illusions, one bloody battle at a time. Now he stood in this freezing prison camp, responsible for men he could no longer protect, unable to provide them with even the most basic necessities like food and warmth. The rations the American guards had provided earlier that day consisted of thin soup with a few pieces of potato floating in greasy water and a small chunk of black bread that was more sawdust than grain. It was barely enough to keep a man alive, let alone provide energy in the brutal cold that seeped into their bones and made every movement an exercise in willpower. Karl had given his bread to Wilhelm, who needed it more, his young body not yet hardened by years of deprivation like Karl's had become. The gesture was automatic, born from months of looking after the younger soldiers under his command, trying to keep them alive when death surrounded them on all sides. Outside, the American guards walked their patrol routes, their boots crunching on the frozen ground, their breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. They were better equipped than the prisoners, with thick winter coats and regular meals, but they too felt the bite of the cold and the weight of being far from home during the holiday season. Private Anthony Russo, a 24-year-old from Brooklyn, New York, stamped his feet to keep the blood flowing as he stood watch near the main gate. Anthony's family ran a small Italian restaurant in his neighborhood, a place where the smell of garlic and tomato sauce filled the air, and his mother's laughter echoed through the dining room as she served plates of pasta to regular customers who had been coming there for decades. Anthony had grown up in a household where Christmas Eve meant the Feast of the Seven Fishes, a tradition his Sicilian grandmother had brought with her when she immigrated to America at the turn of the century. The table would be covered with dishes of bacala, calamari, shrimp scampi, clams, mussels, and whatever other seafood his father could get from the fish market that morning. The whole extended family would gather, cousins and aunts and uncles crowding into their small apartment, children running underfoot while the adults argued good-naturedly about politics and told stories of the old country. The memory of those gatherings made Anthony's chest tight with homesickness, a feeling he tried to push away by focusing on his duties. But on Christmas Eve, it was impossible to ignore the ache of being so far from everything familiar. Corporal James Washington, Anthony's fellow guard, walked up beside him, his dark skin almost invisible in the growing darkness, except for the white of his eyes and teeth. James was from rural Georgia, where he had picked cotton on his family's small farm until he was old enough to escape the crushing poverty and limited opportunities afforded to black men in the Deep South. The Army had been his ticket out, though he quickly discovered that the segregation he thought he was leaving behind followed him even into the military, with separate units and unequal treatment that reminded him constantly that some Americans were considered more equal than others. Despite this, James carried himself with quiet dignity, his tall frame straight and proud, refusing to let the injustices diminish his sense of self-worth. "Cold enough to freeze the Mississippi tonight," James said, his southern accent thick and warm despite the frigid temperature. Anthony nodded in agreement, looking out over the compound where dim lights barely illuminated the barracks that housed their German captives. "You think those poor bastards in there are thinking about home tonight?" James continued, his voice dropping to a contemplative tone. "Same as us, I reckon, wishing they were anywhere but here." Anthony considered this, his gaze drifting to the barracks where he could see shadows moving behind the thin windows. "My old man always said that soldiers are the same everywhere, just boys who got caught up in old men's arguments," he replied, remembering conversations at his father's restaurant table where veterans of the Great War would gather and share stories, their eyes distant as they recalled muddy trenches and poison gas attacks. "Hard to hate a man when you know he's probably missing his mother's cooking same as you." Inside the officers' quarters of the American camp, Captain Robert Henderson sat at his desk reviewing supply requisitions and personnel reports, the paperwork of war that never seemed to end no matter how many forms he filled out. Robert was from Pennsylvania, where his family had owned a hardware store for 3 generations, a solid business that served their small town's needs for tools and building supplies. He had graduated from West Point in 1939, just in time to see the world descend into chaos, his training put to immediate use in a conflict that had already consumed Europe and was rapidly spreading across the globe. At 38 years old, Robert carried the weight of command with a serious demeanor that his men respected but also found intimidating, his decisions often determining who lived and who died in the brutal blah. Calculations of warfare. Captain Henderson's executive officer, Lieutenant David Cohen, entered the office carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression that suggested he had something unusual to report. David was from Chicago, where his Jewish family had fled from Poland in 1921, escaping the anti-Semitism and violence that would later explode into the Holocaust. His parents had built a new life in America, opening a small tailor shop where they worked 16-hour days to provide for their children and ensure they received good educations. David had studied law at the University of Chicago before the war interrupted his plans for a legal career, his sharp mind and attention to detail making him an excellent officer, even if combat had never been his intended path. "Sir, I've been reviewing our Christmas supplies," David began, his voice carrying the precise diction of someone who chose his words carefully. "We received a substantial shipment yesterday, more than we anticipated, and I've been thinking about something that might seem unusual." Robert looked up from his paperwork, his blue eyes curious about where this conversation was heading. David continued, "We have enough food to feed our entire unit a proper Christmas dinner tomorrow, turkey and all the fixings. But we also have enough to extend that same meal to the prisoners if we choose to do so." Robert leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight as he processed this suggestion. The idea of feeding enemy soldiers, men who had been trying to kill Americans just days ago, a holiday feast seemed counterintuitive to everything military doctrine taught about maintaining proper distance from prisoners. Yet something about the proposal stirred something in Robert's conscience, a recognition that these German soldiers, regardless of the uniform they wore, were still human beings who had been caught up in circumstances beyond their individual control. "What brought this idea to mind, Lieutenant?" Robert asked, genuinely interested in understanding David's reasoning. David set down his clipboard and met his commander's gaze directly. "Sir, my family fled Europe because of what was happening there, the hatred and violence that led to this war in the first place," he explained, his voice carrying an emotional weight that was rare for the usually reserved officer. "I've lost relatives in the camps, people I never got to meet because they couldn't escape in time, and I have every reason to hate the Germans for what their government has done." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "But I keep thinking about something my father told me when I left for the army. He said that revenge and hatred are what created this mess. And the only way out is to remember that every person, even our enemies, is someone's son, or brother, or father. These prisoners aren't the ones running the camps or making the policies, they're just soldiers following orders. Same as us in a way." The wisdom in these words settled over the room like snow, quiet and transformative. Robert had spent years training to be an effective military commander, learning strategy and tactics, understanding how to deploy forces and achieve objectives. But nothing in his West Point education had prepared him for the moral complexities of actual warfare. The enemy was supposed to be faceless, a target to be defeated rather than individuals with families and dreams and fears. Yet here in this frozen corner of France, faced with the reality of young German soldiers shivering in inadequate barracks, the abstract concept of the enemy became uncomfortably concrete and human. "The Geneva Convention requires us to feed them adequately," Robert said slowly, thinking through the implications. "But there's a difference between adequate rations and a Christmas feast. Some of the men might not understand, might think we're being soft on the enemy or wasting resources that should go to our own troops." David nodded, acknowledging the valid concern, but his expression suggested he had already considered this obstacle. "We could present it as a matter of demonstrating American values, sir, showing that even in war we don't lose our humanity or our capacity for mercy. It might also have practical benefits for intelligence gathering, as prisoners who are treated well are more likely to cooperate during interrogations." End quote. Robert stood and walked to the window, looking out at the compound where American and German soldiers existed in separate worlds, divided by wire and ideology. He thought about his own family back in Pennsylvania, how they would be gathering tomorrow for Christmas dinner, his mother cooking the ham she'd been saving ration stamps to afford, his father carving the meat while his younger sister set the table with their grandmother's china that only came out for special occasions. Every family in America was making similar preparations, celebrating the holiday despite the war, trying to maintain normalcy and tradition in abnormal times. Were German families any different? Were the mothers in Berlin, or Munich, or Hamburg not also trying to create Christmas magic for their children despite the bombs and shortages and fear? "Make it happen, Lieutenant," Robert said finally, turning back to face David with a decision made. "Coordinate with the cooks to prepare enough food for everyone, Americans and Germans alike. Inform the guards about the plan so there's no confusion, and make sure they understand this isn't about politics. Choosing sides? It's about maintaining our own humanity in the midst of all this inhumanity. Christmas is supposed to be about peace on earth and goodwill toward men, and for one night, we're going to act like we actually believe that means something." David saluted and left to begin the preparations, his steps quick with purpose as he headed toward the mess facilities. Within an hour, the entire American camp was buzzing with the news of Captain Henderson's decision, reactions ranging from enthusiastic support to skeptical criticism. Some soldiers thought it was a beautiful gesture that honored the true spirit of Christmas, while others grumbled that their enemies didn't deserve such kindness after all the destruction Germany had caused. Sergeant Frank Murphy, a grizzled veteran from Boston who had fought in North Africa before transferring to the European theater, was particularly vocal in his opposition. "We're supposed to be fighting these bastards, not feeding them turkey dinners," Frank complained to anyone who would listen, his Irish accent thickening with anger as he paced near the mess tent. "My brother died at Normandy, cut down by German machine gun fire before he even made it off the beach. and now we're going to sit down and break bread with the same kind of men who killed him? The pain in Frank's voice was real and raw, a grief that had not diminished in the months since he received the telegram informing him of his brother's death. Patrick Murphy had been 2 years younger than Frank, a kid who had worked as a longshoreman in Boston Harbor before getting drafted, a boy who loved baseball and had dreams of opening his own pub someday. Private Timothy O'Brien, Frank's friend and fellow Bostonian, tried to offer a different perspective. "Sarge, I get it, I really do," Timothy said, his young face earnest beneath the helmet that seemed too large for his narrow frame. "But Captain Henderson's got a point about not losing our humanity. My ma always taught me that hating people only poisons your own soul. And that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing not to let the anger consume you. Maybe feeding these Germans isn't about them at all. Maybe it's about us choosing to be better than the hatred that started this whole mess." Frank wanted to argue, wanted to hold on to his anger because it felt righteous and justified, a shield against the grief that threatened to overwhelm him whenever he thought about Patrick. But Timothy's words, spoken with the simple faith of youth, created a small crack in that shield. Frank remembered his mother back in Boston, a devout Catholic who attended Mass every morning and genuinely believed in the teachings about loving your enemies and turning the other cheek. She had raised her sons to be tough, but also compassionate, to stand up for themselves but never to become bullies, to remember that every person was made in God's image regardless of which side of a conflict they found themselves on. In the German barracks, the prisoners remained unaware of the discussion happening among their captors, focused instead on trying to survive another freezing night with minimal rations and fading hope. Karl Hoffmann sat with his back against the rough wooden wall, his eyes closed as he tried to transport himself mentally to somewhere warm and safe. He thought about his wife Anna and their daughter Lisa, wondering what they were doing at this moment, whether they had enough food to celebrate Christmas, or if the war had stripped away even that small comfort. Anna worked in a factory now, producing ammunition for the Wehrmacht, her delicate hands that used to create beautiful embroidery, now assembling bullets that would kill men like the Americans guarding this camp. Lisa would be 8 years old now, Karl calculated, trying to picture how she might have changed in the 2 years since he last saw her. When he left for the front, she had been a little girl who still believed in fairy tales and Christmas miracles, who would sit on his lap and beg him to read her stories about brave knights and beautiful princesses. Did she still believe in those things, or had the war stolen her innocence along with everything else? Karl had tried to write letters home whenever possible, carefully worded messages that said nothing about the horrors he witnessed, but attempted to convey his love and longing for his family. He had no idea if those letters ever arrived, if Anna and Lisa knew he was still alive, or if they had already mourned him as another casualty of Hitler's mad ambitions. Wilhelm Fischer, the young corporal, was crying quietly in the corner, trying to muffle his sobs so as not to disturb the others or appear weak. This was his first Christmas away from home, and the homesickness was crushing him with an intensity he hadn't anticipated. He thought about his mother's kitchen in Munich, where she would be preparing the traditional Christmas goose, the smell of roasting meat and spices filling their small apartment. His father would be setting up the Christmas tree, carefully hanging the ornaments that had been in their family for generations, each one carrying memories of Christmases past. His little sister Greta, only 12 years old, would be practicing carols on the piano, her fingers stumbling over the keys as she tried to perfect the songs for their church service. Karl heard Wilhelm's stifled crying and moved across the barrack to sit beside the young soldier, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's all right, son," Karl said softly, using the same gentle tone he employed with his own daughter when she was upset. "Being homesick isn't weakness. It's proof that you have people worth missing, a life worth returning to when this madness finally ends." Wilhelm looked up at Karl with red-rimmed eyes, his young face streaked with tears and grime, looking far too vulnerable for someone who was supposed to be a soldier in the greatest army the world had ever seen. "Do you think we'll ever go home, Sergeant?" Wilhelm asked, his voice cracking with emotion and exhaustion. "Or will we die here in this frozen hellhole, forgotten by everyone who ever cared about us?" The question hung in the air between them, heady with the weight of uncertainty that defined their existence as prisoners of war. Karl wanted to offer reassurance, to promise that everything would work out fine, but he had learned long ago that false hope was crueler than honest uncertainty. Instead, he chose his words carefully, trying to provide comfort without dishonesty. "I don't know what the future holds, Wilhelm. None of us do," Karl admitted, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had seen too much to offer easy platitudes. "But I do know that we're still alive, still breathing. And as long as that's true, there's hope. The war can't last forever. Nothing does. And when it ends, we'll find our way back to the people we love. Your mother will cook you that goose, your father will embrace you, and your little sister will play those carols on the piano while you sing along, even if you can't carry a tune worth a damn." This last comment brought a small smile to Wilhelm's face, a brief crack in the despair that had engulfed him. Lieutenant Hans Becker joined them, his officers bearing evident even in the degrading circumstances of captivity. Hans had been listening to the conversation, moved by Karl's attempt to comfort the young soldier, recognizing the fundamental decency that persisted even in the midst of war's dehumanizing brutality. "Sergeant Hoffmann is right," Hans added, his schoolteacher voice calm and authoritative. "History shows us that even the longest wars eventually end, and when they do, life continues. People rebuild, families reunite, and somehow humanity finds a way to carry on despite everything. We must hold on to that knowledge, use it to sustain ourselves through whatever trials still await us." End quote. As the German prisoners huddled together for warmth and comfort, sharing what little hope they could muster, the American kitchen staff was working feverishly to prepare the unprecedented Christmas feast. Staff Sergeant Lorenzo Martinez, the head cook from San Antonio, Texas, oversaw the operation with the precision of a military campaign, his strong hands moving efficiently as he organized ingredients in the dough. Delegated tasks. Lorenzo's family owned a Mexican restaurant in San Antonio, where he had learned to cook from his grandmother, a formidable woman who ruled her kitchen with an iron skillet and could make magic with simple ingredients like beans, rice, and chili peppers. The Army had recognized Lorenzo's culinary talents and put them to use feeding soldiers, a job he took seriously because he understood that good food was one of the few comforts available to men living in constant danger. Tonight he was preparing turkeys, dozens of them, along with mountains of mashed potatoes, gallons of gravy, stuffing seasoned with sage and onions, green beans, dinner rolls, and even pumpkin pies that had arrived in the das. Supply shipment. The mess tent was filled with steam and delicious aromas, a stark contrast to the frozen wasteland outside, and Lorenzo found himself actually enjoying the work despite the unusual circumstances. "Never thought I'd be cooking Christmas dinner for Nazis," commented Private Bobby Jenkins, a young man from Alabama who was peeling his 50th potato of the evening. Bobby's hands were raw from the work, his fingers wrinkled from constant exposure to cold water, but he kept at the task with steady determination. Lorenzo shot him a sharp look, his dark eyes flashing with reproach at the casual use of the term. "They're not all Nazis, Bobby. That's like saying every American agrees with everything our government does," Lorenzo corrected, his voice firm but not unkind. "Most of those boys out there are just soldiers, same as us, fighting because they were told to, not because they believe in Hitler's insanity." Bobby considered this, his limited worldview challenged by Lorenzo's broader perspective. Growing up in rural Alabama, Bobby had seen the world in simple terms of us versus them, good versus evil, with little room for the nuance and complexity that actual human experience demanded. The Army had begun to expand his understanding, throwing him together with men from different backgrounds and regions, forcing him to recognize that the stereotypes he had been taught didn't match the reality of the individuals he met. "I suppose you're right, Sarge," Bobby admitted slowly, continuing to peel potatoes with renewed thoughtfulness. "My daddy always said that hating a man for where he was born is the laziest kind of prejudice, and I reckon that applies to Germans too." As midnight approached, the preparations were complete, and Captain Henderson gave the order to begin serving the meal. The American soldiers ate first, filling the mess tent with conversation and laughter, as they enjoyed food that reminded them of home and family. Anthony Russo sat with James Washington and several other soldiers, savoring every bite of turkey and talking about their family's Christmas traditions. "My Nama used to say that food is love made visible," Anthony said between mouthfuls of mashed potatoes. She believed that sharing a meal with someone, even an enemy, was a sacred act that acknowledged our common humanity. James nodded, thinking about his own family's traditions. The Christmas mornings when his mother would make biscuits and gravy, the smell filling their small farmhouse and drawing everyone to the table. "In my family, we always set an extra place at the table on Christmas, a reminder to welcome strangers and remember those who have less than us," James shared, his southern drawl soft with memory. "Mama would say that Jesus himself might show up as a stranger needing a meal, so we better be ready to receive him with open hearts and full plates." After the American soldiers finished their meal, Lieutenant Cohen organized a group to bring food to the German prisoners. The soldiers carried trays laden with the same feast they had just enjoyed, walking through the cold night toward the barracks where the Germans waited, unaware of what was about to happen. Anthony Russo was among those chosen for this duty, his arms loaded with plates of steaming food, his heart beating faster with a mixture of nervousness and excitement about how the prisoners would react. When the Americans opened the door to the first barrack, the German soldiers looked up with expressions of fear and confusion, their bodies tensing for whatever hardship was about to be inflicted upon them. Karl Hoffmann stood instinctively, positioning himself between the Americans and the younger soldiers, ready to protect them even though he knew resistance was futile. But instead of orders or punishment, the Americans gestured toward the mess tent, their expressions friendly rather than hostile, their intentions unclear but seemingly benign. "Kommen Sie, Essen, Weihnachten," Anthony said, in terrible German, his Brooklyn accent mangling the words as he tried to communicate that they should come eat Christmas dinner. The prisoners stared at him in disbelief, certain they had misunderstood or that this was some kind of trap. Karl stepped forward cautiously, his eyes searching Anthony's face for signs of deception or cruelty, but all he saw was a young man with a genuine smile, holding a plate of food that smelled better than anything Karl had before experienced in months. "Is this real?" Karl asked in heavily accented English, his voice barely above a whisper as if speaking too loudly might shatter the illusion. Anthony's smile widened, and he nodded enthusiastically, pushing the plate into Karl's hands and gesturing again toward the mess tent. "Real as it gets, buddy. Merry Christmas," Anthony replied, his voice warm with sincerity that transcended the language barrier. Slowly, hesitantly, the German prisoners began to move toward the door, following the Americans through the frozen compound toward the brightly lit mess tent. When they entered the tent and saw the tables laden with food, the reaction was one of stunned silence, followed by disbelief that gradually transformed into something approaching joy. These men, who had resigned themselves to hunger and cold and misery, were suddenly confronted with abundance and warmth and generosity from the very people they had been taught to view as enemies. Wilhelm Fischer's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than despair. His young face transformed by a smile that seemed to erase years of hardship in an instant. The American soldiers began serving the prisoners, filling their plates with turkey and potatoes and all the accompaniments, treating them not as defeated enemies, but as guests at a shared celebration. Lorenzo Martinez personally served Lieutenant Becker, recognizing the officer's insignia and showing him the same respect he would afford any ranking soldier. "Eat up, Lieutenant, there's plenty for everyone," Lorenzo said, his Spanish accent adding musicality to the English words. Hans accepted the plate with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness, struggling to find words adequate to express his gratitude. As the Germans began to eat, the Americans watched their reactions with satisfaction, seeing the pure pleasure on faces that had been marked by suffering and deprivation. Some of the prisoners ate slowly, savoring every bite, as if trying to make the experience last forever, while others devoured the food with the desperation of men who had known real hunger. Karl Hoffmann found himself sitting across from Anthony Russo, the two men separated by language and nationality, but united in the simple human act of sharing a meal. Anthony pulled out a pack of cigarettes and offered one to Karl, who accepted with a nod of thanks. As Anthony lit both cigarettes with his Zippo lighter, the small flame briefly illuminating their faces in the dimness of the tent, He tried to think of something to say that might bridge the vast divide between them. "You got family back home?" Anthony asked, using simple words and hand gestures to help convey his meaning. Karl understood and nodded, reaching into his tattered uniform to pull out a small photograph that he kept pressed against his heart, protected in a waterproof pouch that had survived countless battles. The photograph showed a pretty woman with kind eyes and a little girl with braids, both smiling at the camera in happier times that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Anthony looked at the picture and felt a pang of recognition, seeing in these strangers' faces the same love and longing he felt for his own family. "Beautiful family," Anthony said softly, returning the photograph with careful respect. "The war's gotta end sometime, and when it does, you'll get back to them." Karl tucked the photograph away again, over his heart where it belonged, and nodded with an expression that mixed hope and sorrow in equal measure. Across the tent, James Washington was attempting to teach Wilhelm Fischer the words to "Silent Night," the one Christmas carol that transcended national boundaries and existed in both German and English versions. Wilhelm knew the song as "Stille Nacht," having sung it every Christmas Eve of his life in the church his family attended in Munich, his voice joining with the congregation in the familiar melody that spoke of peace and holy calm. Now, in this unlikely setting, surrounded by former enemies, Wilhelm found his voice again, singing softly in German, while James sang the English words, their voices blending in a harmony that was far from perfect, musically, but absolutely perfect in its symbolism. Other soldiers, both American and German, began to join in, each singing in their own language, but creating a unified sound that filled the mess tent with something approaching the peace the lyrics promised. Men who had been trying to kill each other just days ago now raised their voices together, acknowledging through song the shared humanity that war tried so hard to obliterate. Fright Murphy, the Boston sergeant who had been so opposed to this whole endeavor, found tears streaming down his face as he listened to the carol. Thinking about his brother Patrick, and all the other boys who would never come home, whose voices were silenced forever by the violence of war, Captain Henderson stood at the edge of the tent, observing the scene with Lieutenant Cohen beside him, both officers recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. "This is what we're fighting for, isn't it?" David said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just to defeat an enemy, but to preserve the possibility of moments like this, where people can recognize each other as human beings, despite everything that divides them." Robert nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat, his West Point training having prepared him for tactical decisions, but not for the profound moral complexity of watching enemies become, if not friends, at least fellow humans sharing a moment of grace. As the evening progressed, small conversations began to spring up wherever language barriers could be overcome through gestures, drawings, and the few words of each other's languages that soldiers had picked up. Karl Hoffmann learned that Anthony Russo's family owned a restaurant and that he desperately missed his mother's cooking, while Anthony learned that Karl had been a carpenter before the war, building furniture and cabinets for his neighbors, in a small town whose name Anthony couldn't pronounce, but whose loss Karl felt deeply. They discovered that they were both fathers of daughters, both men who had been forced to leave behind the people they loved most to fight in a war neither of them had wanted. Wilhelm Fischer showed Bobby Jenkins photographs of his family's bakery, pointing to the pictures of elaborate cakes and pastries his father created for weddings and celebrations, his hands moving animatedly as he tried to describe the different recipes and techniques. Bobby, who had never traveled more than 50 miles from his Alabama farm before joining the Army, was fascinated by these glimpses into a world so different from his own. Realizing that the Germans he had been taught to hate had lives and dreams and talents just as valid as his own. "Maybe when this is all over I could visit your bakery," Bobby suggested through gestures and broken German, the idea seeming absurd given the circumstances but somehow also perfectly reasonable in this moment of chaos. Connection. Hans Becker found himself in conversation with Captain Henderson, the two men discussing education and the future in a mixture of German and English, supplemented by Latin phrases they both knew from their classical Bach educations. Hans spoke about his students, the young minds he had tried to shape before the war interrupted everything. His hope that somehow, Education might prevent future generations from repeating the mistakes that had led us to this catastrophe. Robert listened with genuine interest, recognizing in Hans a kindred spirit, someone who valued learning and reason over the brute force that had come to dominate their world. "You know what's ironic?" Hans said in careful English, his teacher's precision evident even in his second language. "I taught my students about the Great War, about how it was supposed to be the war to end all wars. And now here we are, repeating the same insanity on an even larger scale. We learned nothing from all that death, that suffering. We just waited 20 years, and then did it all again with better weapons and more efficient ways of killing each other." End quote. The bitterness in his voice was palpable, the disillusionment of an intelligent man forced to confront the limits of reason in a world governed by violence and hatred. Robert had no easy answers, no comforting words that could address the fundamental tragedy Hans articulated. "Maybe this time will be different," he offered, knowing even as he spoke that it sounded hollow. "Maybe the scale of destruction will finally be enough to teach us that war solves nothing, that violence only breeds more violence. Or maybe we're doomed to keep repeating this cycle forever, each generation learning the lesson and then forgetting it as soon as the survivors die and the memories fade." End quote. It was a depressing thought, but in this moment of shared honesty, both men felt compelled to acknowledge the darkness rather than hide behind platitudes. As midnight approached, someone suggested singing more carols, and soon the tent was filled with music again, a chaotic but joyful blend of German and English Christmas songs. "O Tannenbaum" merged with "O Christmas Tree, Joy to the World" competed with "Ihor Kinderlein Comet." And through it all, the men sang with an enthusiasm that had nothing to do with musical talent and everything to do with the relief of being, for one night, something other than soldiers and enemies. Lorenzo Martinez contributed by teaching everyone a Spanish carol his grandmother used to sing, Los Pises en el Rio, his rich voice leading them through the unfamiliar melody and words. The pumpkin pies that Lorenzo had carefully prepared were brought out for dessert, and the look of wonder on the German prisoners' faces when they tasted this uniquely American dish was almost comical. Most had never encountered pumpkin used in a sweet preparation, their culinary tradition treating it as a vegetable for soups and savory dishes, and the combination of spices and sweetness was a revelation. Wilhelm declared it the best thing he had ever tasted, earning laughter from the Americans who tried to explain through gestures and broken language how the Pilgrims and Indians had supposedly shared a similar feast centuries ago, creating a tradition that had become central to American identity. Frank Murphy approached Karl Hoffmann, the sergeant having wrestled with his emotions throughout the evening, his anger at the Germans warring with his recognition of their essential humanity. Karl looked up at Frank with cautious eyes, sensing the conflict in the American soldier's expression, prepared for whatever confrontation might come. Instead, Frank extended his hand, his calloused palm open in a gesture of reconciliation. "My brother died at Normandy, killed by German soldiers, and I've hated all of you for it," Frank said slowly, his Boston accent thick with emotion. "But looking at you tonight, seeing you with your family's picture, hearing you sing the same psalms my mother taught me, I realize that hating you won't bring Patrick back. It won't change anything except poison my own soul." Karl took Frank's hand, gripping it firmly as he looked into the American's eyes and saw the pain and loss reflected there. "I am sorry for your brother," Karl said in halting English, the words inadequate but sincere. "I have lost friends too. Good men who died for nothing, for ideas that were lies. War makes us all victims, even those of us who survive." The two men stood there, hands clasped, representing in that moment all the soldiers on both sides who had suffered losses they could never fully articulate, grief that would follow them for the rest of their lives, regardless of which flag they had fought under. The handshake lasted only a few seconds, but it represented something profound. A recognition that the enemy was not some abstract evil, but rather human beings caught in circumstances beyond their control, doing what they believed necessary to survive and protect their own. Frank released Karl's hand and turned away quickly, not wanting the other men to see the tears that threatened to spill down his weathered cheeks, his emotions too raw and complicated to share publicly. But Karl understood. having experienced his own moments of breaking down when the weight of war became too much to bear, when the pretense of strength had to give way to honest grief. As the evening wound down, the American soldiers began clearing the tables, while the German prisoners helped without being asked, working alongside their captors in a companionable silence that would have seemed impossible just Kane. Hours earlier, Wilhelm Fischer carried dishes beside Bobby Jenkins, the two young men exchanging smiles and the occasional word in broken attempts at each other's languages, a friendship forming that transcended the artificial boundaries of nationality and ideology. Lorenzo Martinez supervised the cleanup with the same efficiency he had brought to the preparation, making sure everything was properly stored and the mess tent left in good order. Captain Henderson checked his watch and realized it was nearly 1 in the morning, Christmas Day having arrived while they were all occupied with this unprecedented gathering. He caught Lieutenant Cohen's attention and nodded toward the exit, signaling that it was time to return the prisoners to their barracks. David began organizing the guards to escort the Germans back to their quarters, the practical necessities of maintaining security reasserting themselves even after the evening's remarkable suspension of normal hostilities. The prisoners understood what was happening and began gathering near the door, their expressions showing reluctance to leave the warmth and fellowship they had found in the mess tent. Before they departed, Anthony Russo approached Karl Hoffmann one final time, reaching into his pocket to pull out a small object wrapped in paper. "For you," Anthony said simply, pressing the package into Karl's hands. Karl unwrapped it carefully to find a bar of chocolate, a luxury that had become almost mythical during the war years when sugar and cocoa were rarities reserved for special occasions or black market transactions. The gift was small in material terms, but enormous in its symbolic weight, representing a kindness that Karl had not expected to find in this place, from these people he had been taught to view as enemies. "Thank you, my friend," Karl said, the last word feeling strange on his tongue because he had never imagined calling an American soldier his friend, yet in this moment, no other word seemed appropriate. "I will share this with Wilhelm, the young one who needs sweetness in his life more than I do." Anthony smiled and nodded, understanding the gesture even if he couldn't follow all the words, recognizing in Karl the same protective instinct toward younger soldiers that Anthony felt toward the new recruits in Fries, his own unit. They shook hands, two men from different worlds, who had found common ground in the most unlikely of circumstances. The German prisoners filed out of the mess tent and into the cold night, but somehow, the freezing temperature seemed less brutal than before, as if the warmth of the meal and the fellowship they had experienced had created an insulation against the physical hardships of their situation. They walked back to their barracks escorted by American guards, who no longer seemed quite like jailers, but rather like fellow soldiers, doing a job neither group had chosen. The compound was quiet, except for the crunch of boots on frozen ground, and the distant sound of artillery that reminded them all that the war continued beyond this small pocket of peace. Back in the barracks, the German prisoners settled into their sleeping areas, but unlike previous nights, there was an atmosphere of something approaching contentment rather than despair. Wilhelm Fischer carefully broke off a piece of the chocolate bar Karl had shared with him, letting it melt slowly on his tongue and savoring the rich sweetness that evoked memories of peacetime celebrations and childhood treats. Hans Becker sat on his bunk, thinking about his conversation with Captain Henderson and wondering if perhaps there was hope for humanity after all, if men from opposing sides could recognize each other's common humanity, even in the midst of war. Karl Hoffmann lay down on his thin mattress, the springs poking through the worn fabric, but for once he didn't focus on the physical discomfort. Instead, he thought about the evening's events, trying to understand what had happened and what it might mean. He had spent years seeing Americans as the enemy, accepting the propaganda that portrayed them as ruthless invaders, intent on destroying Germany. But tonight he had encountered human beings who possessed the same capacity for kindness and decency that he hoped still existed in himself. The cognitive dissonance was challenging, forcing him to reconsider assumptions he had held for years, to acknowledge that perhaps the world was more complex than the simple narratives provided by those in power. In the American barracks, Similar conversations were taking place as soldiers processed the evening's events and tried to articulate what they had witnessed and participated in. Anthony Russo wrote a letter to his family, describing the Christmas dinner and trying to explain why feeding their enemies had felt like the right thing to do, though he struggled to find words that would adequately convey the beret experience. "Ma, you always taught me that sharing food is an act of love, and tonight I think I finally understood what you meant," he wrote, his handwriting cramped and messy on the thin paper. "These German soldiers aren't monsters. They're just men like me, missing their families and wishing this war would end. For one night, we stopped being enemies and became human beings together." James Washington sat with several other soldiers, including Timothy O'Brien and Bobby Jenkins, discussing the evening and its implications. "You think this changes anything?" Bobby asked, his Alabama drawl carrying a note of uncertainty. "I mean, tomorrow we'll still be at war, still fighting Germans, still trying to kill each other. Does one night of singing carols and sharing turkey actually matter in the long run?" It was a valid question, one that didn't have an easy answer, forcing them all to grapple with the limitations of individual acts of kindness in the face of systemic violence. "Maybe it doesn't change the war," James replied thoughtfully, his deep voice contemplative. "But it might change us, might help us remember that the men we're fighting are human beings, not devils or monsters. That knowledge might not stop the killing, war being what it is, but it might prevent us from becoming the kind of men who enjoy the killing, who forget that there's a cost to every life we take." His words hung in the air, heavy with the wisdom of someone who had thought deeply about morality and violence, about how to maintain one's humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away. Timothy O'Brien added his own perspective, his youth not preventing him from grasping the profound nature of what they had experienced. "My parish priest used to say that every act of kindness is a small victory against the darkness. That we can't control the big things, but we can choose how we treat the people in front of us. Tonight, we chose kindness, and maybe that's all we can do. Make that choice over and over again, even when everything around us is screaming for hatred and revenge." End quote. The religious framework of Timothy's understanding might not resonate with everyone, but the essential message about choosing compassion despite circumstances that encouraged cruelty was something they all could appreciate. Frank Murphy remained quiet during these discussions, still processing his own emotional journey from anger to something approaching forgiveness. He thought about Patrick, wondering what his brother would have thought about tonight's events, whether he would have approved of showing kindness to the enemy or felt betrayed by the gesture. Patrick had been the gentler of the two brothers, the one who believed in giving people second chances and looking for the good in everyone, while Frank had always been more cynical, more willing to see the worst in human drassel. Nature. Perhaps, Frank thought, Patrick would have understood tonight's dinner better than Frank himself did, would have recognized it as an expression of the values they had been raised with, the Catholic teachings about loving your enemies and showing mercy to those who persecute you. In Captain Henderson's quarters, Robert sat with Lieutenant Cohen, both men too energized by the evening's events to sleep despite the late hour. They shared a bottle of whiskey that Robert had been saving for a special occasion, the amber liquid warming them from the inside as they reflected on what they had orchestrated and witnessed. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Robert asked, not doubting his decision but curious about David's assessment now that the evening had concluded. Will the higher-ups see this as compassionate leadership or as fraternizing with the enemy? David considered the question carefully, swirling the whiskey in his glass and watching the light play through the liquid. "I think we did something profoundly human, sir, and whether that qualifies as right in military terms is almost beside the point," he answered slowly. "We reminded ourselves, and those German soldiers, that there's more to existence than killing and being killed, that even in the worst circumstances, we can choose to act with dignity and compassion. If we get reprimanded for that, well, I can live with that consequence." End quote. His voice carried a conviction that came from deep moral certainty, from knowing that some actions are worth taking regardless of their professional ramifications. Robert raised his glass in a silent toast, acknowledging the truth of David's words. They drank together, two officers who had managed to create a moment of peace in the midst of war, knowing that tomorrow they would return to their regular duties, that the killing would resume, and the world would continue its violent trajectory. But for tonight, they had proven that another way was possible, that soldiers could recognize their shared humanity even across the battle lines, that Christmas could mean something more than just a date on the calendar. The whiskey burned pleasantly as it went down, a small warmth against the cold reality that awaited them with the dawn. Christmas Day arrived with gray skies and temperatures that somehow felt even colder than the previous night, as if nature itself was asserting the harsh reality after the brief respite of the holiday dinner. The American soldiers went about their duties with the usual efficiency, but there was a subtle change in how the guards interacted with the German prisoners, a slight softening in their demeanor that hadn't existed before. When Anthony Russo brought the morning rations to the barracks, he made eye contact with Karl Hoffmann and offered a small nod of acknowledgement, a recognition that something had shifted between them even if neither could fully articulate what that shift meant. The German prisoners received the same inadequate rations they had been given before, the brief abundance of the Christmas feast not changing the practical realities of prison camp life or the limitations of available Buron supplies. But as Karl distributed the meager bread and thin soup to his fellow prisoners, he noticed that the men seemed to carry themselves differently, with a dignity that hadn't been present before. The Christmas dinner had reminded them that they were human beings worthy of respect, not just defeated enemies to be warehoused until the war's conclusion, and that knowledge changed how they faced the hardships of Ye's captivity. Wilhelm Fischer approached Karl with a question that had been troubling him since he woke that morning. "Sergeant, why do you think they did it?" he asked, his young face earnest and confused. "Why would the Americans feed us like that, treat us with kindness when we're their enemies? What did they gain from it?" Karl looked at the young corporal, seeing in his expression the struggle to reconcile the evening's experience with everything they had been taught about American brutality and ruthlessness. The propaganda that had painted their enemies as inhuman monsters, bent on Germany's destruction. "I don't think they did it to gain anything, Wilhelm," Karl answered after a moment's thought, his voice carrying the weight of his own evolving understanding. "I think they did it because they're decent men who wanted to maintain their own humanity, to prove to themselves that they haven't become the kind of people who can only see enemies instead of human beings. Maybe they did it for us, or maybe they did it for themselves, but either way, it was a gift, a reminder that kindness hasn't been completely destroyed by this war." His words were simple, but contained a profound truth that Wilhelm was beginning to grasp. The recognition that morality existed independent of strategic advantage, that people could choose compassion simply because it was, quote, right. Over the following days, word of the Christmas dinner spread through both the American and German ranks, carried by soldiers who rotated through the camp and shared the story with others. Some responded with admiration, seeing it as a noble gesture that honored the best traditions of military conduct and human decency. Others criticized it as weakness, as an inappropriate fraternization with the enemy that blurred the necessary distinctions between friend and foe. But regardless of people's opinions about the event itself, no one could deny that it had happened, that for one night, soldiers from opposing armies had sat together in peace, sharing food and songs and recognition of their brave, common humanity. The war, of course, continued with its relentless brutality, indifferent to individual acts of kindness or moments of connection between enemies. Men continued to die in muddy fields and bombed-out cities. Families continued to receive telegrams informing them of losses that could never be recovered, and the machinery of violence ground forward toward its eventual conclusion. The Christmas dinner at the POW camp near Reims became a footnote in the vast story of the war, a small incident that would be remembered by those who participated, but largely forgotten by history's grand narrative. But for the men who were there, both American and German, the evening remained a touchstone, a memory they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Years later, when Karl Hoffmann was finally released and returned to his wife and daughter in Germany, he would tell them about the Christmas when American soldiers fed him turkey and sang carols with him, when enemies became, for a brief moment, fellow human beings sharing in the spirit of the season. Anna would listen to the story and weep, not from sadness, but from relief that even in the midst of horror, moments of grace could still occur, that the man she loved had encountered kindness when he most needed it. Wilhelm Fischer would return to his family's bakery in Munich, where he would spend the rest of his life creating beautiful cakes and pastries, each one an assertion of beauty and sweetness against the darkness he had witnessed. He would never forget the taste of that American pumpkin pie, so foreign and yet so wonderful, a flavor that represented everything strange and hopeful about a world beyond the narrow confines of his previous experience. On Christmas Eves, when his own children and eventually grandchildren would gather around the table, Wilhelm would tell them about the holiday he spent as a prisoner of war. When men who should have been enemies showed him that kindness could survive even the worst circumstances humanity could create. Anthony Russo returned to Brooklyn after the war, taking his place in his family's restaurant and eventually inheriting the business from his father. He married a nice Italian girl from the neighborhood, had 4 children, and lived a life that from the outside seemed unremarkable, the ordinary existence of a working-class man in post-war America. But he never forgot Karl Hoffmann and the other German prisoners, never stopped thinking about that Christmas Eve, when his grandmother's wisdom about food being love, made visible, took on a deeper meaning than he had ever imagined. Sometimes, when customers in the restaurant would complain about trivial things or express casual hatred toward people they considered enemies, Anthony would tell them about feeding Christmas dinner to German POWs, using the story to gently challenge their assumptions about who deserved compassion and kindness. James Washington used the GI Bill to attend college after the war, becoming a teacher in a segregated school in Georgia, where he tried to pass on to his students the lessons he had learned about human dignity and the importance of recognizing our shared humanity across all the artificial divisions that society created. The Christmas dinner became a central story in his teaching, an example he would use to illustrate how people could choose compassion even in the most unlikely circumstances, how individual actions mattered even when they couldn't change the larger systems of oppression and violence. His students, growing up in the Jim Crow South and struggling against racism and discrimination, found hope in the story, seeing in it proof that change was possible, that people were capable of transcending their conditioning and connecting across seemingly insurmountable barriers. Captain Robert Henderson and Lieutenant David Cullen both remained in the military after the war, their careers taking them to various postings around the world as America embraced its role as a global superpower. They stayed in touch over the years, occasional letters and rare visits that maintained their friendship and their shared memory of that Christmas Eve. They would sometimes discuss whether their decision to feed the German prisoners had been militarily appropriate, whether it had violated some regulation or protocol, but they never questioned whether it had been morally right. The evidence of its righteousness was in the memory itself, in the recall of men singing together and sharing food, in the knowledge that they had created a moment of peace in the midst of war's chaos. Frank Murphy carried the memory differently, as a turning point in his understanding of grief and forgiveness. He never stopped missing Patrick, never fully recovered from the loss of his younger brother. But the Christmas dinner helped him realize that holding on to hatred only multiplied the pain without bringing Patrick back or honoring Io. His memory. Frank returned to Boston after the war and became active in veterans organizations, eventually working to promote reconciliation between former enemies and advocating for understanding across national boundaries. He would often cite that Christmas Eve as the moment he learned that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing what had happened, but about refusing to let hatred consume his own soul. Hans Becker returned to teaching after spending 2 years in the POW camp, finding his way back to a classroom where he could shape young minds and try to prevent future generations from repeating the mistakes that had led to such catastrophic violence. He taught his students about the war, not as a glorious adventure or a simple story of good versus evil, but as a complex tragedy that resulted from failures of empathy and imagination, from the inability to recognize our common humanity across national and ideological boundaries. The Christmas dinner became a central example in his curriculum, a real-life illustration of how people could transcend their conditioning and connect with those they had been taught to hate. Proof that another way was always possible if people were brave enough to choose it. The mess tent where the dinner took place was eventually dismantled, and moved to another location as the war progressed and military needs shifted. The tables where Germans and Americans had sat together were used for countless other meals, serving soldiers who had no idea of the history those simple pieces of wood carried. The physical evidence of that Christmas Eve disappeared into the flow of time, absorbed back into the war effort, and eventually discarded when the conflict finally ended. But the memory persisted in the hearts and minds of those who had been present, passed down through their families as a story worth preserving and sharing. Decades later, when Karl Hoffmann was an old man living in the reunified Germany that had emerged from the Cold War's conclusion, he received an unexpected letter from America. It was from Anthony Russo's daughter, who had heard her father's stories about the German sergeant he had befriended during the war and wanted to make contact while both men were still alive. She had tracked Karl down through military records and veteran organizations, a search that had taken months but finally yielded results. The letter described how Anthony had never forgotten Karl, how the story of their Christmas Eve encounter had shaped his understanding of human nature and influenced how he raised his children. Karl responded immediately, his hands shaking as he wrote in careful English about his own memories of that night, about how Anthony's kindness had helped him survive the darkest period of his life, about how the chocolate bar had tasted like hope in a world that had seemed devoid of it. The two men, now in their 80s, began a correspondence that would last until Anthony's death 3 years later. Letters that bridged the decades and the distance, that proved the connection forged on that Christmas Eve had been real and lasting. They never met again in person, the practical difficulties of international travel for elderly men being too great. But through their letters they maintained the friendship that had begun in such unlikely circumstances. When Anthony Russo died in 1997, his daughter sent Karl a photograph that her father had requested be shared with his German friend. It showed Anthony standing in front of his Brooklyn restaurant, wearing an apron and holding a wooden spoon. His face creased with age, but his smile still recognizable as the expression of the young private who had handed out plates of turkey to prisoners of war more than 50 years earlier. On the back of the photograph, Anthony had written a message, "To Karl, my friend across the battle lines. Thank you for teaching me that enemies are just friends we haven't broken bread with yet. May we meet again in a world finally at peace." Karl kept that photograph on his mantle until his own death 2 years later, a reminder of the truth that Anthony had articulated so simply. When Karl's grandchildren asked about the picture of the smiling American man, Karl would tell them the whole story. From the cold barracks on Christmas Eve to the moment the doors opened and American soldiers invited them to share a feast, from the first hesitant bites of turkey to the sound of carols sung in 2 languages. From the handshake with Sergeant Murphy to the chocolate bar that tasted like humanity's better angels. He would tell them that war was real and terrible, that the suffering and loss couldn't be dismissed or minimized, but also that even in war's darkest moments, people retained the capacity for kindness, for recognizing their shared humanity with those they were supposed to hate. The legacy of that Christmas dinner extended beyond the individual lives it touched, becoming a small but significant part of the larger story of how former enemies became allies and eventually friends in the steam post-war world. The reconciliation between Germany and America, between Germany and its other former enemies, was built on countless individual acts of recognition and forgiveness, on moments when people chose connection over continued hatred. The Christmas dinner at the POW camp near Reims was one tiny thread in that vast tapestry of reconciliation. But for those who experienced it, that thread was as strong as steel, binding them to a truth about human nature that transcended national boundaries and ideological conflicts. In the end, the story of German POWs being fed Christmas dinner by American soldiers in France became exactly what Lieutenant David Cohen had hoped it would be. A demonstration of values that were worth fighting for, a proof that humanity could survive even the most dehumanizing circumstances. It showed that soldiers could be warriors when necessary, that didn't have to surrender their capacity for compassion, that enemies on the battlefield could recognize each other as human beings deserving of basic dignity and respect. It was a small story in the context of a war that killed millions and reshaped the entire world. But for those who were there, it was everything. A moment when the future they were fighting to create became briefly, beautifully real. The Christmas of 1944 had come and gone, marked by a single evening of shared food and song in a corner of France where the war raged on. The men who participated returned to their roles as soldiers and prisoners. The machinery of conflict resumed its operations, and the world continued its violent trajectory toward the war's eventual back. Conclusion. But something had changed, something subtle but profound, in the hearts of men who had been there. They had seen proof that another way was possible, that the choice to recognize our common humanity was always available, even in circumstances that seemed to demand hatred and dehumanification. They had learned that enemies were not born, but created, and what could be created could also be unmade, one act of kindness at a time, one shared meal at a time, one Christmas carol sung together in the language of former foes who discovered they were really just fellow human beings lost in the same terrible storm, hoping to find their way home.